That was a marvelous beginning. I must say, just speaking personally, that I've had the great privilege of working with Mike Carson and Jane, and they're just absolutely terrific, as the results of these conferences show. Now, it's my privilege. I'm John Murphy. I'm the moderator of the panel on the changing character of weapon systems, unarmed systems, and unmanned vehicles. I've noted, and I'm sure all of you have noted, that this conference in general has been considering real cutting-edge issues. And I think it's appropriate to congratulate Derek Jinks and others who have put together this conference because it's really quite an extraordinary lineup of subjects and issues that we are considering. I would suggest that the issues covered by this panel are perhaps especially timely. They've gotten a lot of coverage in the press. As most of you know, I believe, on March 25th, 2010, Raul, the new legal advisor to the Department of State, gave a speech on, and I quote, the Obama administration and international law. Gave a speech to the annual meeting of the American Society of International Law. The speech covered a variety of topics. With respect to one of these topics, the use of force, spoke quite briefly, really, of the use of, quote, advanced weapon systems. In particular, he's talking about drones, which he referred to as unmanned aerial vehicles, and defended their use against charges that they violated the law of armed conflict, arguing that they helped, quote, to make our targeting even more precise. And he ensured that they also helped to make the best intelligence available for planning operations, and they served to minimize civilian casualties. On May 28th, 2010, however, Philip Alston, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial summary or arbitrary executions, issued a report on targeted killings. Paragraph 22 of which took note of Coe's argument that the targeted killing by drones were justified as an exercise of self-defense on the basis that the United States is in an armed conflict with al-Qaeda as well as with the Taliban and associated forces. But the report suggests that although Coe's statement is, and I quote, an important starting point, it fails to address some of the most central issues. Well, this lady to my right, our first speaker, Hina Shamsi, senior advisor to the project on extrajudicial executions at New York University, who is thanked in Alston's report, and I quote, for her superb assistance in the preparation of this report. I was trying to get her to confess that she actually wrote it, but she will have none of that. She will be addressing some of these issues that Coe did not. She will be followed by our next panelist, to her immediate right, Kenneth Anderson, professor of law at American University, who is highly likely to have a somewhat different perspective on these issues than Hinsa. Although the use of drones has had the most substantial coverage by the media, it's important to note that the drones are not the only example of unmanned systems or unmanned vehicles. Increasingly, robots in the form of unmanned ground vehicles are being used in Iraq and Afghanistan against IEDs, or in some cases, these robots have their own firepower capability and are used as instruments to kill the enemy. As part of his presentation, Colonel Darren Stewart, who is one more down the line here, of the British Army and Director of the Military Department, International Institute of Humanitarian Law, San Remo, Italy, will discuss these robots. And Pete Pedrozo of the International Law Department here at the college will be our final speaker. Pete's at the end of the table here. And Pete will act as a commentator on the three previous presentations. Now, just a administrative, I guess, what I would say, point or two, and that is that each panelist will speak for a maximum of 30 minutes, hopefully somewhat less. We will take our break at 9:40, which, as you know, has been the general custom, after Ken Anderson concludes his presentation. And finally, we will entertain questions and comments after Pete Pedrozo has finished with his comments, which of course will be after the debate. Hina?
Thank you very much, Professor Murphy. And let me begin by thanking the organizers for inviting me and also for putting together such a terrific set of panels. Part of the value, I think, of conferences like this has been not just what's discussed during panels, but what is discussed outside of panel discussions in the hallways, and that has also just been tremendous. So thank you very much. I'm going to talk, as Professor Murphy said, about the use of drones in the context of targeted killings, and I'm going to do it in the framework of the report put out by Professor Alston. I did have the privilege of contributing to the report, and I think it's appropriate for me to iterate that I am, though, here in my personal capacity, and I'm not representing him as a spokesperson or representing the United Nations in any way. Before I talk about the substance of the report, though, I wanted to make just a couple of preliminary observations. One is that the report itself, well, first of all, to the extent that people haven't read it, and I'm not expecting anyone to have, it is available at the website of the organization that supports Professor Alston's work, and that is www.extrajudicialexecutions.org, which is always a very dire address to give out, but that's what it is. The report covers a fair amount of topics and controversies, and it does so under some significant constraints, including the fact that it is in the format and required format of a UN report, and the primary constraint is that we were limited to 10,700 words. The report goes over that, but that still left a lot of cut pieces on the floor. And Professor Alston and I are working on a follow-up article that elaborates a number of the concepts that there wasn't space to include in the report. And so my presentation today is very much in the spirit of welcoming comments and input and insight that will be addressed in greater detail as we go forward. Second, as I think most of you know, the report came up yesterday during the discussion of the keynote speech, and it struck me that that while I know many of you in the audience are experts and are very, very familiar with what a special rapporteur does, there are probably people who are not aware of what this exotic creature / position is about. And if those who already know will indulge me, I wanted to talk a little bit about what the position is, what the mandate is, and why it is that there would be a report on targeted killing by Professor Alston. The United Nations created the position of Special Rapporteur on Extrajudicial Executions in 1982. It was the second of so-called thematic mandates that report to the Commission on Human Rights at that time, but now the Human Rights Council, on issues that the Council deems to be of particular significance. So apart from extrajudicial executions, there are any number of thematic mandates, including the mandate on torture, the use of counterterrorism and human rights, arbitrary detention, disappearances. The important thing, one of the important things to know about these mandate holders is that they are independent experts and specifically appointed to be independent experts. They are not United Nations employees, and although they report to the Human Rights Council, they are still independent of it beyond the terms of what their mandate informs or requires them to cover. In the case of Professor Alston, under the resolutions of the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly, the mandate is actually very, very general. It includes to examine situations of extrajudicial, summary, or arbitrary executions and to submit findings together with conclusions and recommendations. In the years since the mandate was instituted, and I think a great deal under Professor Alston, who became Special Rapporteur in 2004, the Special Rapporteurs have themselves evolved an understanding of what that mandate covers. And very basically, Professor Alston's view of it has been that it covers all kinds of unlawful killings that killings that are unlawful under both humanitarian law as well as human rights law. And very concretely, this is done through, for example, fact-finding investigative missions. Since I've been with Professor Alston, we've been in Colombia last year, and Colombia came up a number of times yesterday when we were talking about the manual that its military is using, and we were able to see and discuss with the Colombian government and its various component parts, including, very importantly, the military, the extent to which they do and do not apply the law of armed conflict, human rights law, in reference to their operations both against the guerrilla as well as paramilitary groups, and also the issues that the government faces when you have extrajudicial unlawful killings committed by the military. Another example of the way in which Professor Alston has worked and applied his mandate is, a trip he took to Congo, again at the end of last year, where one of the issues really was the legality of the conduct of multinational forces under the various different frameworks of law and their civilian protection obligations. I think it would not be out of turn to say that part of the independence of the mandate positions, and Professor Alston means that he is judiciously, I think, but also critical of all of the various components in the international legal system that speak to his mandate, including in the case of the Congo mission, the role of the United Nations itself with respect to civilian protection obligations. The flip side of that is that his independence renders him liable to criticism from all actors, including governments, NGOs, the United Nations, etc. Why do I go into such detail about this? Well, one of the things that you should know is the reason for him writing a report on targeted killings is that the second part of his work is to do analytical in-depth writing on issues that are cutting edge or that have not, in his opinion, had adequate examination under the international legal system, and targeted killings was an important part of that. But there is also a history with respect to the mandate itself and the issue of targeted killings and the use of drones that I think it's important to keep in mind, which is that starting in 2002, when the first publicly known, credibly assignable to the United States drone attacks took place, the then Special Rapporteur asked the United States to provide legal justification for the attack, as well as the factual basis for determining that the attack which took place at the time, which was in Yemen, complied with the applicable legal frameworks, the law of war and the law of armed conflict. In its response at the time, the government, and I'm actually going to divide it into the Bush administration, the Obama administration, because there's been some change, responded, and it further elaborated on its response when Professor Alston asked for greater detail in 2005, that in essence, the Human Rights Council, the United Nations Human Rights Council, as well as the system of special procedures of which Professor Alston's mandate is a part, lacks the competence to examine all abuses committed in the context of armed conflict, i.e., don't look at law of armed conflict violations, which is really the first time that the United States had raised this objection. And it is, and as Professor Alston noted at the time and has since, especially problematic when you've also got the concept that the United States also, the Bush administration offered that in its response that also the human rights law did not apply extraterritorially, and certainly human rights law did not apply in the context of armed conflict. The issues, and especially to both fans and foes of international law, I think are obvious that if the United States position was taken as true by a lot of other countries, it would remove from the mandate of the entire human rights mechanism of the United Nations some very, very important areas of review that, in fact, are not in the United States' interest to have outside of review. So, for example, Professor Alston's work in Congo, in Colombia, would not be able to be part of his mandate. In the first year of the Obama administration, it continued, although more quietly, to take a similar approach. But when the targeted killing report came out last month, the response of the administration did not include that Professor Alston's discussion and review of both law of armed conflict and human rights law was outside of his mandate or outside of its jurisdiction. Now, they may still come back with that, but sometimes omission can be as important as commission, and I'm taking this as an encouraging sign. So let me move on to the issues discussed in the report. Very important to note at the outset is that what the report talks about is the use of unmanned systems, unmanned combat aerial vehicles, drones is what I'm going to use, in the context of targeted killing policies. And it defines targeted killing as the intentional, premeditated, and deliberate use of lethal force by states or their agents acting under color of law or by an organized armed group in armed conflict against a specific individual who is not in the physical custody of the perpetrator. And as I think you all know, targeted killings is not itself a defined term under international law. It's been used to refer to an array of different kinds of killings, both lawful and unlawful. The reason for using the term targeted killing as opposed to, for example, other terms that have been used for various kinds of killings that may be included in this is, one, it's a more neutral term, and thus it acknowledges that, in fact, targeted killing can be legal under specific circumstances, which the report discusses, and to distinguish it from, for example, assassinations, which in the domestic frameworks of various different countries can often require a political component. The report describes the practices of a few states, specifically the United States, Israel, and Russia, of using targeted killings, including in the territories of other states. It largely finds, unsurprisingly of course, that more broadly, that target killings, although they have been used throughout history, have been usually used as exceptional circumstances, often criticized as illegal when when facts came to light that they had been occurring, often criticized as illegal by various states which may have used them in other contexts. And the reason for the report at this time, as Professor Alston points out, is that there is now a policy of adopting targeted killings in broader circumstances that, in his view, in the view of the report, threaten to destabilize the international legal frameworks applicable to armed conflict as well as situations outside the context of armed conflict. I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. But one of the, I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. Let me take you through some of the more specific issues and do it as quickly as I possibly can that are addressed. Number one, given that we're talking about unmanned systems, the report addresses the legality of those unmanned system and combat aerial vehicles per se, and notes that although some have suggested that drones are prohibited weapons because they cause or have the effect of causing unnecessarily indiscriminate killings, that that in fact drones are no different from guns, from guns fired by a soldier, helicopter firing missiles, airstrikes from other gunships, and that the issue really is the same with respect to each weapon, whether its specific use complies with the laws of armed conflict. The report's greater concern, and this is sort of a pragmatic concern, I think, is that because drones make it easier to kill with less risk to states and therefore make them a justifiably attractive option, that policymakers and commanders will be tempted to interpret the legal limitations on who can be killed and under what circumstances more expansively. And the report discusses in greater detail later on the issues with direct participation in hostilities. I'll come to that and such. But the idea being that there should not be any kind of difference or expansion of those categories because of the use of new technology, a concern that I think applies every time you have new technology being used. The report also emphasizes that while drones proponents are correct that they provide the ability to have greater surveillance, often greater precision, nevertheless, caution has to be exercised in terms of recognizing the importance, as Blaise Cathcart referred to yesterday, of intelligence, that human intelligence still remains a critical challenge. Professor Alston talks in the report about his experiences in Afghanistan, where there are, significant issues with respect, despite good faith, best efforts to obtain the kind of human intelligence that permits airstrikes and such to be not only accurate but lawful and avoiding mistakes. With respect to drones, very specifically, again staying with that, the report talks about the fact that there are now over 40 countries that we know of that have drones with intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities, and a significant number of countries are obtaining drones that are weaponized. And the concern that Professor Alston raised in his report, as well as to the Human Rights Council, is that whatever rules the U.S. is using in its application of drones and with respect to targeted killings are ones that it has to be able to live by if they are applied by other states which have or are in the process of obtaining drones. For example, Russia, Turkey, Israel, India, China, and Pakistan, all of whom are either have the capacity or are seeking it. And I think that's one of the very important ideas to keep in mind when we're talking about some of the underlying themes of the report, which is transparency and accountability. What are the rules being applied? How public are those rules? And what will we be able to live with when those rules are applied by other countries? A second issue that the report addresses is with respect to the controversy about drone program conducted by the CIA versus that with respect to the military. There has been, as I'm sure many of you know, debate and allegations that the use of the CIA to conduct the program is in itself illegal because CIA personnel are unlawful combatants, unlike the military, and unable to participate in hostilities. And the report finds that that is not the case, that there is not support for that argument, and that, in fact, there is no prohibition against intelligence personnel and others being able to use targeted killings, being able to use drones in this context. However, and we get into this in a great deal more detail about the consequences of CIA participation, CIA themselves being directly participant in hostilities, as well as being open, as well as not having the kind of immunity that the military has. But in in his statement to the Human Rights Council, Professor Alston called for a halt to CIA involvement in the program. And the reason for that was not because it is per se illegal for the CIA to engage in these killings. It is because, in his viewpoint and that of the report, the CIA is not capable of complying with the international law of war as well as IHR requirements of a level of transparency and accountability with respect to the criteria of who is being targeted and how procedures are being applied, what safeguards there are. The military is not perfect in this regard. There remains to be a good deal more transparency, and it's not just an issue with the United States, it's with other countries as well. But as the announcement of the airstrikes in Uruzgan, Afghanistan, that took place last year, an investigation showed that the military has far more than the CIA can have in its DNA, Geneva Conventions, the laws of armed conflict, and therefore has at least a commitment to being able to provide adherence to the laws of war as well as accountability in ways that do not exist with respect to the CIA. I'll come back to these issues in a little bit more detail. But one of the main things that the report does, and we've had discussions with other members on the panel about this, when people talk about targeted killings, when they talk about drones, oftentimes it's conversations that go past each other because so many complicated issues are implicated and people arrive at them in different ways, and these issues include what legal framework applies and how. So what the report seeks to do is really try and very clearly say what are the basic rules. I'm not going to get into them with this audience, but essentially it addresses and lays out the basic rules under the three main frameworks: the context of armed conflict, the context of human rights law, as well as the law of applicable to the interstate use of force. Without getting into the specific basic rules, which I think are probably familiar to everyone, we can talk about them in detail if there are questions, a couple of things to note. One is that the report states and finds that under human rights law, a targeted killing in the sense of an intentional, premeditated, deliberate killing by law enforcement officials cannot be legal because in armed conflict, unlike in armed conflict, it is never permissible for the killing to be the sole objective of an operation. And thus, for example, it talks about why shoot-to-kill policies are violations of human rights law. But that is not to say, and I want to be very careful to point this out, that law enforcement is incapable of meeting the threats posed by terrorists, and in particular, for example, suicide bombers, because under human rights law, lethal force is permitted if it is strictly and directly necessary to save lives, as I'm sure you all know. The issue also with respect to the use of interstate force is addressed in some significant detail. And a couple of things that I would point out there that we can perhaps have more discussion of, which is that the report discusses the controversies that are raised by the United States invocation of the use of self-defense as justification, as Harold Coe provided, in the context of targeted killing, and finds that a number of areas which have not been adequately addressed. One, the issue of consent by the state in which on the territory of which extraterritorial force has been used, which is an issue that's come up with respect to targeted killings in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Somalia, and Yemen. The report talks about the fact that states may consent to the use of extraterritorial of targeted killings on their territory, but only to the extent that they may themselves lawfully engage in those kinds of targeted killing. It discusses also the controversy with respect to the right of self-defense when we are talking about its robust invocation, and I'm hoping that Ken Anderson's going to address this in greater detail, with respect to the United States, where the argument is that once self-defense is invoked, that is the end of the analysis. Instead, the report says, actually, self-defense goes to the use of force extraterritorially, but whether a targeted killing is specifically legal depends on the specific requirements of the law of armed conflict or human rights law as they apply. I'm just going to name the other issues that are covered by the report, and we can talk about them in greater detail, but concerns about the existence and scope of armed conflict in which the right to use targeted killing through drones is raised, and the extent to which that is greater than and destabilizes, again, the legal frameworks applicable to what the law of armed conflict and when it applies. And it also finally addresses the issue of direct participation in hostilities, who may be targeted in the context of armed conflict. And essentially it finds that the ICRC's interpretive guidance is a welcome first step forward, but raises concerns about the continuous combat function as perhaps going beyond what the law of armed conflict allows, although stating that more work needs to be done in terms of refining those categories. Much more to discuss. My time is running out, and I've tried to sort of give you an overview, and hopefully we can have a greater discussion both in the Q&A and afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Hina. I realize that you're facing a very difficult task. It's a long and complex report, so you'll have a chance to elaborate later. Ken?
Thank you. I push the red button?
Yes.
Yes. Well, thank you. I'm very grateful for this opportunity to talk on this issue. And my goal here is not really so much to address Professor Alston's report. So I'm not actually here in this particular discussion to offer a critique of it, but rather I have a more basic and perhaps more selfish question, which is that I, like many of the people in this room, I look across this room and realize that probably every other person here has written some article on the topic of drone warfare, targeted killing, or something like that. This audience has produced an awful lot of scholarship in these areas. And I think that I've probably read more of it than I should really admit. And my question, as I've been reading this expanding body of literature, is why doesn't everybody agree with me? And that's really the question I'd like to take up here. And to take it up and stated more seriously, it goes back to something that was just remarked on, which is that as I look across this body of literature and the approaches that are taken with respect to this, I am struck, as I think all of us are struck, by the sense that they look very much like ships passing in the night, and that there is a very strong sense that the differing legal approaches don't really address each other very well or very much. And so what I actually propose to do here is try and walk through, based on my most recent reading of the literature. It is a large stack in my study, of which at the bottom, firmly underpinning the edifice, is, of course, Nils Meltzer's formidable treatise on targeted killing. And then a vast stack of material, of which Dean Coe's ASIL speech and Philip Alston's report are now the two most recent editions. But I find it impossible to keep up with Mike Schmidt's output on this topic alone. I dare not look at SSRN on a daily basis. So let me walk through what I think the leading positions are and try to give as fairly as I can what I think the underlying premises are. But in order to get there, I would like to walk through what I believe emerges out of that body of literature of basic strategic, legal, and policy questions that these positions are attempting to answer. Most of the legal positions taken do not try to comprehensively address everything. It's one of the reasons for the ships passing in the night phenomenon. They tend to emphasize, for example, is the participation of the CIA lawful or unlawful? Or is there a role for self-defense? Various questions that they may emphasize more than others and hence cause them to not really address what other positions have said. So let me start with what I think are the leading questions that ways of approaching the problem legally would have to address. So the first would be a sort of a what question. And that really goes to the nature of the weapon itself. So is one objecting to this form of use of force because you think that there's something wrong intrinsically with the weapon, with the idea of it as a weapon system? So there are weapon systems that are prohibited under the laws of war. Very often when we look to talk about whether a weapon system might be inherently prohibited, we're looking for things that it's inherently indiscriminate, that it can't be aimed, that it isn't going to manage to sort of lock in on particular lawful targets. That, of course, isn't the issue raised by drones, which in fact run the other direction. And so that question about whether the weapon itself might for some reason be unlawful might seem to be a strange question, and yet there are ways in which questions about the weapon system itself arise. One is the idea that there's something about the nature of this weapon. This is a view which has had some currency in the press, that it induces sort of PlayStation mentality, that it winds up removing the sense of the actors from the actual issues of killing people, that it introduces psychological elements which are bad from the standpoint of making actors aware of their responsibilities and what it is they're actually doing. I think that for most of the people in the military and intelligence communities, that doesn't really seem very persuasive, because if you're sitting on a missile ship somewhere firing off missiles from far away, the same kinds of issues would arise. Nonetheless, it's something which is out in the general discussion of this. I think the larger question which folks have who are raising questions about the weapon itself goes much more directly to the question of whether they think that the weapon removes the risk from the forces using it. And that, I think, is an argument which has been in retreat for the following reason. It was, I think, popular, actually, for a while to get up in front of audiences. I was certainly present in a couple of presentations in which the argument was directly made. The problem with drones is that they remove from U.S. forces the need to fight their way physically to their target in order to attack it. They remove the constraints of geography, and they make it inefficiently easy for the U.S. to attack because it doesn't put enough risk upon its own forces. Now, the reason that that argument, I would say, is in retreat is because the last time I heard it presented, I raised my hand and said, this is bad, why? That is, but it is, I think, something which is out there from, I guess I would say, an excessively neutralist standpoint about the use of force, which essentially suggests that the problem with drones as a weapon system is that they don't put U.S. forces sufficiently at risk in their use. Those are questions that go to the weapon itself, and I think that most of those have really been set aside. And I think for many in the military, most of these questions don't really arise. That is, it's seen as essentially being just a substitute battlefield weapon, another air support device. You could use a manned system, you could use an unmanned system. These are just choices that are made, and the rules of engagement and the laws of war are fully applicable, and so they don't really raise questions in that way. That then, I think, squarely puts on the table what I think is the biggest issue and the real reason that there's controversy over the use of the weapon, which is really a question of who. And it's the question of who is lawfully able to use the weapon and who is lawfully able to use force. And that goes to the question of, is the CIA's use of this weapon lawful or not? And in many respects, I would say that that's the sort of 10,000-pound elephant in the room. Is this use by the CIA, is it lawful? And of course, one of the reasons that that is so controversial and yet at the same time so crucially important a question is because the drone as a technology, the weaponized drone as a technology, effectively serves as a stalking horse for a much deeper argument over the question of whether the CIA ought to be or lawfully uses force ever. Right? That is, there's nothing special about the drone as the mechanism for using force. The same questions would arise if it were a covert operations team entering into Somalia or someplace and engaging in uses of force there. So I would suggest that the main controversies that arise over the use of drones begin once it moves from being just a substitute battlefield weapon to the question of uses of the weapon by civilian intelligence actors of various kinds. Now, that's the question of who from the standpoint of who may be an operator. There's a second kind of question about who, which goes to the question of who may be targeted. And I'm going to set that question aside as a separate issue for a moment. Let me switch to a question of why use the weapon. Right? So in other words, ask a question about what are the ways in which the weapon is used strategically by different kinds of actors in order to understand the different kinds of legal questions that will be raised and will be emphasized by different ways of addressing this. So let me walk through what I think are the strategic uses of drones at this moment. One is, and the least controversial, and I won't say more about it, is simply as a substitute weapon on the tactical battlefield where it's just any other weapons, air support system, and there's not really a lot more to say about it. The second use of drones would be any questions that may arise if one is dealing, for example, and I'll focus on Afghanistan, Pakistan mostly in this description, in the sort of classic hot pursuit questions. If one thinks that the hot pursuit questions across the Pakistan border raise legal questions, then the use of drones is going to be obviously a question there, regardless of who's using them. Again, I don't think that that's really where the argument comes down. So let me move one step over further, which would be the use of drones in a wider range of missions in Pakistan and a wider geography in Pakistan, particularly in the hands of the CIA, where the targets are said to be, or the mission is tasked to be, going after high-value, intelligence-driven leadership targets in al-Qaeda, where it's not hot pursuit across the border, it's not part of a sort of spillover battle, but you are really attempting to use the weapon strategically as a way of attacking the leadership in their safe havens once they believe that they've withdrawn to some place where they would be difficult to attack. And then I guess we could finally add to that attacks using drones by perhaps military actors or by the CIA that go outside of any of those zones. Somalia, Yemen, potentially other kinds of places, and then finally just to complete the puzzle, would be the use of drones in future situations that have nothing to do with the current armed conflict with al-Qaeda, that have nothing to do with al-Qaeda at all. that have nothing to do with the current motivations for using them now. So imagine, as a pure hypothetical, a resurgence in Latin America of a new generation of Sendero Luminoso that has somehow identified the United States as being especially the enemy and has got their hands on sarin gas. I mean, in other words, something that owes nothing to the current situation, but is a situation that could conceivably face a president some years down the road. Those different strategic uses, I think, all raise potentially different legal issues, but whether they do or not depends on how one addresses yet another set of sort of policy and legal questions. So let me go to those. And I guess the first question in this is really the question of whether the uses of force under international law have to be regarded as an exhaustive binary in which they are either law enforcement uses of force or else they must fall necessarily into armed conflict and the laws of armed conflict in some fashion. So in other words, is that an exhaustive binary? And I'll note in passing that Harold Koh's statement at ASIL was notable, most importantly, I would say, because it very carefully at several points said armed conflict or, not and, but armed conflict or legitimate self-defense. And that phrasing was, I think, correctly understood to be a reference to uses of force that go outside of this binary. And so it is staking out with simply the use of the word or a very important legal position about what are the lawful methods by which and circumstances under which force can be used. And so that's going to be a hugely crucial legal question. Is it a binary or is it something else which is implied by this or legitimate self-defense? The second question that arises legally will be the question of whether there is any geographical limitations on the nature of an armed conflict. So assume that you are in an armed conflict, and the next question is going to be, are there legal limitations built into the notion of armed conflict as a legal term which implies something about its geographical extent? And some of the writers on this have referred to theaters or referred to zones or referred to battlefields even. Those who have responded to them in various ways have pointed out that none of those terms are actually legal terms, that none of those are defined terms within the law of armed conflict itself, that they're terms of art and terms of convenience, but they carry independently no legal significance. And that second question arises because even if you believe that the binary is exhaustive, if you then are on the armed conflict side of the use of force in that binary, there will be then this further question about whether your armed conflict can be said to extend anywhere in the world or whether there are any logical legal limits on what that constitutes. Then the next question is one that I've already raised, which is the question of who may lawfully participate in all the many questions that have been raised over the course of these several days about direct participation in hostilities, who may lawfully participate, who may lawfully use force. Now, I believe that those largely set out the framework of legal questions that would have to be addressed in all of this. And now let me step back and walk through what I believe are the leading positions at this point and give an idea of how they address those particular questions. So I would say that the position which most represents the view of the international legal community, meaning that which Professor Alston has put out in his report, or I'd say the ICRC's informal view, Dr. Meltzer's treatise, I would say sort of across that range, would be a combination of at least three independent premises. The first of these is, first of all, that it is an exhaustive binary. So in other words, all the uses of force have to be either law enforcement on the one hand or armed conflict in its technical legal meaning on the other. But second, added to that as an independent premise is that war, that armed conflict in a legal sense cannot be worldwide. It has geographical limitations of some kind, however one winds up defining them. And added to that, a third independent premise, which is that in some way or other, as a general proposition, human rights law is going to govern in places where armed conflict law does not, and leaving aside the question of the role of human rights law within the armed conflict. So in other words, even if you have an armed conflict, its geographic scope is not unlimited, and outside of the area in which you have a lawful armed conflict, then human rights law will be fully into effect. And that will then land you in the territory of the question of whether you've got an unlawful extrajudicial execution or not. Okay. All right, second position, let me shift over to what I think would be the extreme at the other end. And this would be roughly the Bush administration's global war on terror view. Because and in some ways, it's not actually the most extreme sort of opposite position. They don't really line up easily on a single line continuum, but let me sort of lay that out as sort of a different view. The Bush's global war on terrorism accepted, if not the binary, it accepted that what was going on was in fact, or is in fact, an armed conflict. Right. And it then, however, said there aren't any geographical limitations attached to that, but it goes beyond simply saying the war goes wherever the participants go. What I think was legally striking, and I think legally alarming to so many people about the Bush administration's view of the global war on terror, was not simply that it said, well, wherever the participants go, the conflict follows them. It said something further. It said, we are entitled anywhere in the world to use the legal incidence of armed conflict, meaning the legal regime of armed conflict to detain people, to interrogate people, to hold people. We're entitled to use those with regards to anybody that we regard as part of the armed conflict wherever they are in the world. Okay. Now that's a much more sweeping notion of what your rights are in the armed conflict, made available to you by regarding it as global in that sense. And I guess I would say that what raised alarm bells about that was that it didn't depend on any notion of hostilities taking place in any particular location. Instead, what it was really claiming was, even if hostilities are not underway, if we think that you're a person who is in some way connected to the armed conflict, we have got all the legal rights under the laws of armed conflict to be able to regard you that way. That, I think, is what caused the geographic pushback to say, come on, you got to at least have hostilities. And in that sense, I think that the overreach of the Bush administration was, it wasn't actually interested in waging hostilities on a global basis. It was never interested in carrying hostilities everywhere in the world. What it wanted was the legal rights attached to the fact of being in a state of hostilities. And in that sense, I would say that it was rather the tail of law wagging the dog of war. And I think that was the problematic part of it. Now let me switch to a third position, which is one that I tend to associate with many military lawyers, in fact, which is to say, well, look, on the one hand, we accept the binary, but on the other hand, we reject the geography constraint. We just don't think that there's, the war goes where the participants go, and we are not going to allow ourselves to be locked into an asymmetry of saying that you can withdraw to a safe haven somewhere, and all of a sudden we have to go and try and arrest you. I mean, that's not going to be an acceptable asymmetry in the nature of the conflict. Nonetheless, we do accept that it's an armed conflict, and we regard that as the relevant legal frame. But the armed conflict goes only where the hostilities go. Right? And if we're not engaging in hostilities, then law of armed conflict is not apply there. But if you are part of the target set, so to speak, then we may initiate hostilities against you in that particular place, and in which case the relevant law will be the law of armed conflict. This is very attractive in general, and I think that many people expected that that Harold Coe was essentially going to endorse that view and no more in his ASIL speech. What I found striking about the ASIL speech was the fact that it went beyond that, that it wound up endorsing the idea that there are other uses of force out there which do not rise to the technical legal definition of an armed conflict, and in particular, the intensity, sustained level of hostilities that is required in order to have a non-international armed conflict, which is, after all, how all the branches of the U.S. government have characterized the struggle, at least with al-Qaeda. And in that sense, it moves away from the Bush administration's view that it's a global war on terror, hostilities present or not, but at the same time, it goes to a reach to self-defense as being an independent basis for using force, which may not be a technical state of armed conflict. And in that sense, I believe that the administration saw itself really as reaching back to a much longer running line of thought about self-defense, really running back to the Abe Sofair 1989 speech, in which self-defense is taken as an independent ground, that it's not exhaustive with, and it's not identical with armed conflict. And I believe that that's where the administration is, and that one of the reasons that it's there is because it believes, first of all, that this is a long-running position of the U.S. government stretching back many, many decades. And second, that it believes that this is the right way to characterize the core uses of force by the CIA in this. And that one may reach a conclusion that as a policy matter, it is a really bad idea ever to allow the CIA to use force. Perfectly legitimate policy position to reach, but not one which is prohibited by international law, at least as indicated by state practice going back a really long way. And that, in fact, on both policy and legal grounds, governments around the world have found the ability to use civilian actors in covert ways, in ways in which they're not making any claims about armed conflict, and they're not making any claims of privileged combatancy. They are disavowable, they are deniable, they are forgettable, has been a tool of policy which many, many states have used. And which perhaps ought to be given up, but that's essentially the debate which is placed on the table by the use of drones in this. Now, let me sum up by saying that this does not exhaust all of the views. There are other ones. There are, for example, the Murphy-Radson view that we should quasi-judicialize it, have the targeting, the question of who may be targeted, subject to some kind of special set of rules. One of the things that Dean Coe correctly pointed to was, in his speech, was to say that if you have a use of force, there must be rules which tell you how it may be used. And it may not be the technical law of armed conflict because you don't regard yourself as using force in that case in an armed conflict. But let me suggest in closing that one of the things that I thought was very important about Harold Coe's speech was, if you accept the idea that there can be a category of the use of force outside of armed conflict in the first place, so just taking that by assumption, one of the things that the Coe speech did was to put on the table, for the first time that I'm aware of, an acceptance of the idea implicitly that there will be uses of force which are covert, but that those uses of force must themselves conform to certain basic principles, he said. Not laws of armed conflict, but principles drawn from the law of armed conflict which are applicable in all uses of force, irrespective of what their other legal bases might be. And he specifically named distinction and proportionality, to which I would add necessity, and I think was implied by what he said. That is, to my knowledge, the first time that someone of his position in any leading country has stood up and essentially said there will be covert uses of force, and that is an important tool to have available to us and lawful to us. But there are also rules governing its use that go to the question of how it has to be used. And as a minimum, I'd suggest those are not going to be able to be lower than what it is that the military would use in any case. The last point, then, is simply that the question on the table is really not the military use of these things, but the CIA use. The single most important article that I'm aware of that's been written publicly about drone warfare at the moment is one referred to by Ryan yesterday, Adam Entus's Reuters piece, where he suggests, and I believe that this may well be the view inside the intelligence community, that drone use in Pakistan is now evolving into two quite separate functions, one of which is the classic high-value, covert, quasi-covert leadership attacks that have been most of the focus. But that very rapidly there is developing a genuine separate armed conflict in Pakistan in which the Pakistan government is taking on the fight with its own Taliban, and that the CIA is providing essentially an air support arm in a fairly overt way. I believe that's lawful on a DPH analysis of that. I'd also suggest as a policy matter that I don't think that the CIA is actually very comfortable with this. As one person said to me, we're not interested in any circumstances in recreating Air America ever again. We believe that our value is in high-value, added, intelligence-driven, genuinely covert targeted killing. And we don't see this as a turf struggle to want to hang on to this particular category. Our only reason for doing it is we believe that the president has made a decision that Pakistan's desire is to say that the U.S. military is not operating in Pakistan at this point overrides the concerns about whether the CIA ought to be engaged in what amounts to an overt war. On that note, let me stop and leave it for coffee, I guess.